Ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to write comics. But looking at the state of the industry these days, I'm starting to think I dodged a bullet. These days, the comic book business is in turmoil. Practically every year, there's a reboot at the big two, Marvel and DC Comics. And most comics these days barely last 6 or 8 issues before they're canceled. Creative teams change at the drop of a hat, and there's no real direction or even continuity between the titles. Everything is so unstable that heroes don't even keep the same secret identity, and in the case of Thor and Iron Man, they don't even keep the same gender anymore. Comics today are more confusing than they were when I was a kid. Back then, you saw your favorite characters dressed up in that brightly colored spandex, and you knew who they were, and that allowed you to buy your favorite comics. And the stories were very easy to follow. Anyone and everyone could follow things out. But when I look at the mess the big two have become, it's a nightmare from a creative standpoint. When you are trying to write a story, oftentimes you have to do research into the backstory of a character. And when you look at the Marvel comics and the DC comics and the continuity they have, it's pretty much become a big jumble. In between all of these reboots, a writer has to try to navigate a course between all of these different series, which are multiple volumes now, because many of these comics just don't have one volume like they were when I was a kid, where you could just pick up Superman from number 1 all the way to 300 and pretty much, follow the continuity. Nowadays, thanks to the constant cancellations, you have to deal with Superman Volume 1 or Captain America Volume 1, which was the original 1960s one, all the way to the 1990s one, to another one that started in 2004, to another one that started in 2008, and then you have to deal with multiple character secret identities, like in the case of your Captain America, who's gone through John Walker, who was Captain America, a bunch of other guys, Bucky, who was Captain America for a brief time, the Falcon, who was Captain America now, and at this point, again, Falcon and Captain America are Captain America. And that's a real headache to deal with from a creative standpoint, because when you're a writer, what you want to do is you want to do your research and then set a course for the story you want to tell. And when you have to deal with all this continuity baggage, that makes it all the more frustrating. And then you want to use certain characters, and then you're told by your editor this character's dead, and then a year later you're told this character's alive, and it becomes really confusing to deal with from a creative standpoint. And another frustrating thing that a writer would have to deal with is the instability in the comic book publishing world, because just as you're starting to find a groove with this character and starting to find a feel for the character, you're told that the series is canceled after the 8th or maybe the ninth issue, and that they're going to relaunch again. And at that point, you become very frustrated, because when I know as a creator myself that you don't really find a groove with a character until maybe 6 or 7 stories in. That's when you start to find a feel for them and find a groove for them. Because working on the ISIS series and working on, you know, different stories, I really didn't start to get a real sense or feel for what for the character until maybe about a couple stories in, and then I could get a sense of what direction I wanted to take it, and then I could hit that stride, because that's where really writers don't hit their stride until they really get comfortable with the character, and you really don't get a chance to hit your stride in comics because you really don't have as much space to tell a story in as I do with YA fiction. YA fiction, I have a little bit more space to tell a story, so I can really I started to find my stride with the character around Isis the Beauty Myth, but most comic book writers don't have that type of space. And by about the seventh or eighth issue, they're just starting to get a sense for the character, and they never get to hit that stride. And that's where a lot of these books really struggle, because the writer can't get to that stride point. They can't hit that stride point where they can start really pushing really great stories out, because the first 2 or 3 issues, you're just trying to introduce the main character, what they want to do, what their mission is, and trying to set that course. And you really can't do that because the book is going to get canceled, it's going to get rebooted, and it becomes, really hard for a writer to lay their course for a story or a story arc or even a storyline these days. And I see today's comic book business, it's just a mess to deal with. And when I aspired to write comics when I was a kid, I didn't know it was that bad. I thought it was going to remain, like it was when I was a kid. It was going to be easy to follow, easy to read. You could just pick up at least a run of issues, and then start setting the course for the stories you wanted to tell. But you really can't do that these days, because what happens is the books wind up getting canceled, and then they wind up starting all over again. And what's even more frustrating about that is when they do these reboots, what happens is all that hard work you did trying to navigate that course and then try to lay out your own pretty much is tossed out the window. So there's no incentive creatively for a writer to come into the comic book business as I see it these days. It's just a nightmare to deal with, having to deal with all these retcons, reboots, and having to deal with all that baggage from a creative standpoint. And I'm starting to count my blessings now that I didn't go into the comic book business and that I stayed, learning the trade fiction business and the trade publishing business instead, because over in the trade publishing world, if you were to come to someone and start talking about reboots, and they would look at you and say, "Man, get out of here. I'm not dealing with that." Um, if you write a bad story, they're just going to put a period at the end and move on, and they're not going to put up with that over in the trade publishing world. If there's a favorite character, people will just not, they'll disregard that story and then go read the next story. And they're not going to sit there and deal with reboots and retcons over in the fantasy trade publishing world, the sci-fi publishing world, or the romance publishing world. You have to have a solid story from day one over there, and that's how it is. Even in the self-publishing world, where I'm at, it's just frowned upon. You're just not gonna keep coming at them every year with a reboot. You either have your stuff straight or you don't have it at all. I mean, over the last decade or so that I've been doing SJS Direct books, I've managed to keep my continuity fairly straight in these SJS Direct Universe titles, and everything is pretty much easy to follow. But when I look at the comic book world, it's just sad that there is no focus or any direction. I mean, everything is just so jumbled these days, and it just gets even more confusing with each passing year. When I heard about, the female Thor, I just shook my head. But when I look at this black female Iron Man, I say to myself, this business is really getting messed up over here on the publishing side. They really need some sort of leadership to get this ship right, because it's sad that they had all this momentum with Captain America: Civil War at the doing well at the box office, and all of that is being squandered due to a publishing division that just can't get itself right. And I'm starting to think, that I really did dodge a bullet by not getting into the comic book business, because, again, it would pretty much break my heart to see all that hard work I put into trying to develop a character's stories pretty much tossed by the wayside in a reboot. Because when you write stories as a writer, I know they mean a lot to you, and you really wanted to share something with readers, and for them not to be able to have that ability to share that story, that kind of hurts to see happen when you see stuff like that happen when it comes down to stories. Um, but I look at the comic book business as it stands today. It's just not a place I would want to be right now, because it's just a mess these days. From a creative standpoint, I mean, there's nothing you can really do with it when you have multiple universes, multiple continuities, numerous reboots. You don't even know who this main character is, and you can't set a course to say what they would want, what conflicts they would run into, and most importantly, why should the reader care? And why would a reader care if you keep rebooting everything every year and changing everything up, what is there for the reader to connect with? What is there for the reader to concern themselves with? I mean, if it doesn't matter to the publisher, then it shouldn't matter to the reader. And that's one of the reasons why comic book business is still continuing to struggle almost 25 years later, because they're not giving a reader an incentive to buy into the character's adventures and to connect with the character and their stories. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up SJS Direct titles on Amazon.com. Every story there is pretty much easy to read and easy to follow, and I believe you'll enjoy most of the titles I produce in the SJS Direct universe.